Okay, we're live, and I am here today with a very exciting stream. I am sitting here with Brian Allgeier, who is a friend of mine who goes way back, a ex coworker and a very smart, creative mind. And so this is going to be a lot of fun. I look forward to having a talk with Brian. So thanks for coming, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dave. It's great to be here chatting with you, and congratulations on hitting your Kickstarter with ukulele. I'm really excited to read that book, and you've got 15 days left, and you've already hit the Kickstarter. So hopefully, it just keeps on going.
Hopefully, yes, and thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's been quite a project. So I'll tell you what. Obviously, simply by identifying you as a creative director of Ratchet and Clank, it does sort of speak volumes about your work. But maybe if you can just sort of give a little bit of an introduction so that people know more about you and how you got started, a little bit of history.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working in the industry for oh my goodness, 26 years now, since 92. And I started out as an artist and animator. I went to Savannah College of Art and Design, and I worked at Philips Interactive Media as my first job, which was the first CD-based console. And it was ages ago, and I did animation for Hanna-Barbera's Cartoon Carnival, which was a game we put out, and it was like Scooby-Doo and Huckleberry Hound and Fred Flintstone. So I was drawing a bunch of that stuff, and I realized that my passion lay in design, and so I started working at Insomniac Games in 19. I guess it was 99. And from there, I worked on the Spyro the Dragon series as a level designer. And then eventually as the lead designer and design director on the first Ratchet and Clank. And for that project, we didn't really have a creative director. It was pretty much Ted Price. He was the CD on that. And then throughout the early PS2 era, I was mainly the lead designer. And then when the PS3 games came along with games like Tools of Destruction and A Crack in Time, I became the creative director.
Awesome, that's great. And
And then
just to let people know, if you have any questions for Brian, just go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll get to them as soon as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And just and then so finally, I was recently creative director on the game Edge of Nowhere, which is a virtual reality game that came out in 2016, and I worked on the recent PlayStation 4 Ratchet and Clank game that was based off of the movie that was based off the original game. So that was kind of a fun, surreal experience.
Hmm. That's great. And now, as far as us working together, the first time that we got to work together was back in 2007 on Ratchet and Clank Future, which is also my first title for Insomniac. And I think the last title that we worked on together was Ratchet and Clank Nexus, which involved working with the North Carolina facility. So that was awesome. It was kind of neat to, as somebody just said in the chat, it's strange when everything comes full circle when Ratchet and Clank and ukulele collide. Yeah, and it really is neat to kind of think nostalgically on those days, both back that entire run of time was quite an experience for me.
Yeah, it was a fun period, definitely, and it was really exciting to delve deeper into Ratchet and Clank's story with the PS3 era, and I think we had a really good collaboration in terms of it was you, me, and TJ developing, the scenes and the cinematics, and really breathing life into these characters. And one of the challenges we faced in moving to the PS3 games was we couldn't do as much in terms of the breadth that we had done because we were moving to a new platform. And so we really had to double down on story as kind of a way of creating a very rich experience for players.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. Now, I that makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, I began on the PS3, so I didn't have the reference point of the PS2 games. I mean, I played them, but I really didn't know too much about what differed between the production pipeline. And in fact, my most of my run with Insomniac was, in fact, I think all of it really was within the sort of PS3 era. So I also was not there for the jump to the PS4 Ratchet game. So it's interesting to hear you talk about the juxtapositions between the different platforms.
Yeah, the PS3 era was a very long era in terms of games. I think I'm going to get all my facts wrong here, but I guess it came out in 2006 was when the PS3 came out, and then it lasted until about almost 10 years. I guess it was more like 9 years. Like, when did the PS4 come out? I'm drawing a blank. I think it was maybe like 2016 or 2015,
It was one of those,
around
I
that
think.
time. 20, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But almost a decade, it seems. Maybe 8 years. I could be off by a couple of years.
Right, right.
Uh, and that's a very long console life. So
Hmm.
it really speaks well of the PS, uh, and just the staying power of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was a great platform, and it was a lot of fun to work with. Yeah. So there's so much to cover with you, honestly. Like, it's hard to even know where to begin. But
Yeah.
one thing I do want to bring up is that now you have also written a book, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe we can kind of branch. Honestly, there's no obvious beginning for our conversation because obviously the book is in a way a culmination of experience. But I thought it might be good to start and end on that because I really want to learn more. And we've talked many times, of course, while I was working with Insomniac, about just our day to day experience, but we never really talked more philosophically about sort of more general game design concepts and how those have evolved over time. So it's really cool to see that in your book. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the genesis of that book and what inspired you to begin writing it.
Absolutely. Well, I've always wanted to write a book and illustrate it. My major in Savannah College of Art and Design was in illustration, and that was something that I've always loved to draw ever since I was a little kid. And I always just liked the idea of writing a book. And working in games for so many years, I kept feeling like I kept running into the same problems and same similar challenges, and often employing some of the same solutions and principles that have benefited me as a creative director. And so after I'd been directing games for 10 years, I decided, like, well, actually, it was after about 5 years, I decided, I want to start writing a book. And I started just jotting down all these little tips about things that are very important as a creative director, and what it means to be a creative leader. So, some of these tips included, including your team and collaboration, and making sure that great ideas can come from everywhere, that you're fostering a creative spirit. There's tips in terms of, seeing the problem, not the solution. We tend to, as when you're a director, you usually come up from the ranks of either being an art director or a designer, sometimes a programmer, or even you might have been a project manager. And so you always feel like you are so accustomed to this craft that you've developed all these years that you want to apply that in situations when you're with the team. They'll have a particular problem. You're like, oh, I got the solution. And oftentimes that's not always the best approach to take. You usually have to say, okay, here's the problem, and you have everyone offer up ideas and listen to ideas and let them solve the problems, because you're oftentimes working with a very talented team. So that's, like, one of the many, I guess, tips, that I just thought, this keeps coming up and I should write this down. So about I guess it was around 6 years ago, I started working on this book.
Oh, I think we may have lost Brian. Let's see. Maybe give it a second for him to pop back. All right. Well, I'm going to see if I can reconnect to Brian. Sorry about that, folks. Now you can look at my face while I try and figure out how to reconnect with Brian. So it's just me right now. So how are folks doing? Go ahead and write your questions in the chat, and I'll make sure to pass them on to Brian once he joins back up with us. And I think I'm just going to look and see what we have right now. So it looks like Fiona asked, "Hey Brian, sorry about that. I didn't know there is another version of the Art of Ratchet and Clank book. Is it only available to Insomniac Games employees?" That I don't know. That's, well, it was a question for Brian, so I guess we'll have to ask him. I didn't know there was another version of the Ratchet and Clank book because I'm not on Instagram. Yeah, we'll have to bring that up with him. I think he'll be joining us in just a minute. So yeah, just I'd like to just, as long as it's just me right now, I'll talk a little bit about how Brian and I first connected. So I was just getting started with Insomniac, and Brian was the creative director on Ratchet and Clank Future, as I had mentioned, and so it was an interesting experience because I had no game design experience before that, and Brian being, he'd been on several titles. There were 4 PS2 Ratchet games, and as he mentioned, he was a design lead, I believe, in the first Ratchet and Clank title, and which, believe it or not, it had taken me a long time before I even played the first Ratchet game. So the second one was the one I had the Tools of Destruction was the one I had the most experience with, and so when I joined up with the studio, it was a really neat, interesting experience to get to work with someone who had that much directorial experience, and it was quite a learning process for me. But Insomniac is a studio that spends an awful lot of time and energy on telling stories in an effective way that works well with the gameplay. And so, really, my first tasks were to jump right into cinematic production. I actually began as an animator rather than a story layout artist, and so that was quite an experience to kind of make that evolution from animation to layout and storyboarding. And yeah, but Brian was a wonderful director to work with in that regard. Was able to help ease in that transition, regardless of what my participation was at the company. So yeah, that's kind of how we first connected, and we worked really well together. As Brian mentioned, the writer T.J. Fixman, who I can't remember exactly how he began working at the studio, but they were both wonderful to work with, and we had the sort of separate tiered development in a way where there was the cinematics department, and there was the game design, and there was the art team. There's the environment art team, there's a character art team, all these different groups. So it was a little challenging at first to try and figure out how to kind of communicate really well with every team. And Brian made that communication really easy. Obviously, his experience helped out with that quite a lot. Okay, so Dragmundus, good to see you. Hello. And Fiona says Ratchet and Clank Tools of Destruction is my favorite Ratchet and Clank PS3 game. Yes, that's a great one.
Hey.
Hey, there he is. How are you?
All right. So, long story. I should probably explain what's going on here, why we got disconnected.
Okay, there was
And
an
what I'm
earthquake,
doing
was
right
there?
now. No, it felt like one. So why I'm sitting in my car right now because I basically my house is being worked on, and there's all this crazy noise happening. They're like grinding down my kitchen floor. So I had my phone sitting on the dashboard of my car, and it over. So I decided to drive out to this park where I could chat with you in peace. And then I had my phone on my dashboard, and it overheated. So I
Nah.
got this like temperature warning on my phone. And so it completely, yeah, I know. And there's nothing I could do. I just had to
So
like wait for
what?
my phone to cool down.
So why did Brian's phone break? Well, he was chatting with Dave Cumbo, and it got just a little too heated.
I
Yes.
know, pretty
All right.
much.
Well, I actually, it was kind of, I mean, it was fun because I was able to give a little bit more of a description while you were gone of just how you and I met. But if you don't mind just continuing with where you were, we can just finish up that thought and go from there.
Okay, yeah. So I think I was just talking about this book that I had written called Directing Video Games 101 Tips for Creative Leaders. And the reason why I wrote it was just because I've been in the industry for such a long time and kept seeing the same reoccurring issues and principles, and just decided to write about it. And it was a very fulfilling experience, just coming up with 101 short little principles and problems that a creative director typically faces, and then how those can be resolved, or how people can kind of approach or address those issues that come up. And I tried to make the book as timeless as possible, even though I make references to Edge of Nowhere, which was a 2016 game, and I make a lot of Ratchet and Clank references. I'm hoping that someone can read it in 10 years from now, and all of those principles will still apply, and that's, regardless of what kind of game you're on, they're going to be useful.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense because it almost seems to deal with more general principles of how to work with a team.
Yeah, yeah. I have a mix of, I talk about what it means to be a creative leader, that you essentially have to be an effective leader. You have to work with a team of people and motivate them and inspire them and support them. So there's a lot of that. There's being a coach. There's how do you solve problems? Sometimes you have to sleep on a problem. You can't solve it immediately, whereas that's oftentimes, as a director, you want to feel like you're being decisive and you're making decisions in the moment, but that can also create a lot of a ripple effect and issues if you make the wrong decision too early. So I just talk about some of those challenges as a leader, but then there's also just the craft of being a director and how you use cinematography to compose shots. I talk about how to guide players, through a level, and different techniques and tricks you can use to breadcrumb and light up areas that tends to draw people's attention. And then there's, I talk about mise en scene, and how to environmental storytelling, and kind of techniques you can use to have the world tell a story without having to create a scene. So yeah, there's lots of little, it's just, chock full of these high level tips. And so far it's been getting a really good reception. I'm actually going to talk about it at USC, I think in the springtime. And I've been giving talks on it and teaching various master classes that incorporate a lot of these principles.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's a lot of information actually. Just thinking about how much how to keep it all organized, like how to make a concise presentation for all those ideas. One of the things that I always laugh about my experience with Insomniac is that my job essentially was something I was always fighting because I was always when you say things like doing level storytelling and things like that, I used to run around talking to designers trying to figure out ways to communicate story ideas within the level. And it was kind of ironic in a way because my job essentially was to put it in cinematic sequences to a degree as an animator and layout artist. So that was a lot of fun to try and go back and forth. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that element of it. Is because I mean, my experience right now is as a storyteller. It has been in the past, and so that's what's most interesting to me about working in story and games is how to do that in an interactive way. And I did kind of promise people that we'd talk a little bit about interactivity and storytelling. And so maybe you can speak a little bit about that process.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, Dave, I always appreciate how you got very much involved in the development of the game, and you were in the studio with us recording stuff, and really, like to see all the aspects of how the story was incorporated. In terms of like level design and interactive development, obviously games is an interactive medium. You want to embrace that, and you want to give players a lot of agency or a feeling of choice that they can make, and they're making decisions that are kind of guiding their experience. Apologies for the noise here. Um,
That's the livelihood, the liveliness of you're in Burbank right now, I assume.
I'm actually in Eagle Rock,
Oh,
so I'm at a
nice.
park, and yeah, there's a lot of kids around. I guess they're having some sort of I don't know, event. They're having a soccer game going on here.
All right.
So very lively right now. In terms of, I guess, in telling stories within levels, um, I guess essentially you want to think about when people travel through a level, what are all the stories they will tell, or the possible stories they will tell, the potential of stories. It depends on the game. If you're making a game like Uncharted, which tends to be more linear and more focused, you're going to do a more beat by beat story driven experience. But at the same time, when players have that sense of agency and that ability to control the experience, you want to give them lots of options, and you want to think about what stories are they going to come away with. What are they going to tell their friends after they played the game in terms of the experience that they had. And so you want to create this rich world of interactivity and elements that will ultimately create wonderful stories that you may not predict as a designer. And
Mm.
so that's part of the challenge is creating a rich dynamic world, and then at the same time having a hand of guidance too, where you're helping to kind of guide people to the best moments.
That's got
And
to be a constant battle. That's tough.
yeah, I mean, you look at some of the Ratchet and Clank games, and we would certainly have a main through line, a story that kind of was telling you what your ultimate goal was, where you needed to get through the level. But then we created this fun arsenal of weaponry where, for instance, we had those Drophid enemies, which had these they were like these fish in glass domes filled
Yeah,
with water,
that's right.
and they had these like robotic soldier bodies, and they're kind of humanoid, but they had these fish heads.
Hmm.
And so we had that, and then you could like break them open, and the fish would fall out, and they like flop around on the ground. But if you wanted to, you could throw out the Groovatron and cause those things to dance. You could throw out this. You could do this other weapon where it turned enemies into penguins. I forget what that was, and that would cause them to turn to penguins and dance. You have penguins dancing with fish. Like it would just be kind of ludicrous. And I mean, I guess we kind of knew that was going to happen, but we kind of left it there for the player to discover.
Mm.
And so those are the moments where I feel like people have these fun stories that they can share within the context of this greater story. That's kind of more of the guiding hand of the director.
Right, right. Yeah. The Groovatron was classic. And I love the fact that there were distinct animations for all the characters to have dances. That was
Mm-hmm.
awesome. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And so I guess to elaborate a little bit more, just because I think that that point is really interesting. It seems like that's almost the ultimate. I mean, I wouldn't know, but I feel like that's the ultimate challenge of a creative director, right? Is that you want to juggle between having a distinct vision, a distinct direction, but then also be able to work along the changes that happen during development, but still maintain that vision. But also, it seems like it's a constant. It would be a constant back and forth. So I wonder how you manage to do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I think that you definitely want to work closely with your game director or your lead designer and someone who has more of a handle on all of the mechanics and interactions that happen in the game. And so you want to, you're always talking back and forth about how much of an interactive choice that the player might be able to make could potentially break the experience, that and kind of work against the fiction that you're trying to develop. And so you're always thinking about that. Certainly, I know that you look at a game like Grand Theft Auto, and you can do whatever you want. You can punch people, you can run people over. It gives you you can fully entertain that id side, that deep down
Right.
desire to wreak havoc and do the wrong thing. And and yet you look at a game like Spider-Man, which is also open world, and Spider-Man can run around on the streets and mingle amongst the pedestrians and civilians, but he also can't punch people because he's a superhero. He's a good guy, and
That's
so
right.
you have to think about, okay, if we just let him just clock a poor pedestrian in the middle of the street, like that is not Spider-Man. That's not part of the experience. So those are things that you're always thinking about, and then you have to figure out solutions for what he does. Like, well, he can't punch people, but he'll give them a high five, and so
Right.
that's the way that Spider-Man interacts with the world. And I wasn't the director on that. That was Brian Intihar was the creative director, and Ryan Smith is the game director. And so they had those constant questions come up a lot. And you look at a game like there's some games which people kind of look past. I think Uncharted. I love the example where Nathan Drake is kind of like this cool go lucky guy who's very friendly and is a good guy, but then he's like shooting thousands of people
Yeah,
as
that
he's trying
juxtaposition.
to
Yeah.
basically get some treasure. And so that's something where people, I guess, doesn't bother people, but when you think about it, it's a little weird.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And so that's kind of a balance between. I thought about that a lot actually over the years. Not only in games that I've worked on, but also in games that I've played, where there's that. there's that interesting and kind of hilarious juxtaposition between what the story team is doing and what the game design is allowing you to do. And sometimes you can have these heroic characters that will have this deep sort of introspective philosophical cinematic scenes, and then they'll just be off shooting a bunch of people as soon as it gets back to gameplay.
Right. And there's like a term for that. I think it's called like Ludonarrative Dissonance or something.
Whoa, that's fancy.
I know it does sound fancy, but Ludo meaning game, narrative meaning story, dissonance meaning they're not connected or disconnected. And so that's where that moment happens, where the kind of the game world breaks. And with any creative medium, you're oftentimes trying to suspend disbelief. You don't want to pop that bubble that you worked so hard to create, where people are in this game world, they're fully immersed, and don't want them to start asking questions like, wait a second, why is that, why can I do this, or this just feels completely against who this character is. In a movie, that happens when a character stops acting like a real person, and their like motivations and actions start to no longer feel in line with who they are. And it's really difficult because you'll often, when you're developing a game, you'll often have these, sorry, I have to move something here. You'll have these creative executives or people outside of the project weighing in. You might even have a focus test where all the kids are like, oh, I'd love it for, I can't think of a good example here, but for a character to do something that they normally wouldn't do, and you might feel pressure to put it in, but in the end, if it doesn't align with the vision and the characters in the world, you're risking kind of hurting the experience.
That makes sense. Yeah. Now, if you don't mind, let me cut in because a couple of questions came up, and I just want to get to those. But I also, it's funny because when we lost you, I realized that there was a question for you that I couldn't answer, so I want to make sure that we circle back to that.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
So we got, hey Brian, I didn't know there is another version of the Art of Ratchet and Clank book. Is it only available to Insomniac Games employees? Which I'm also wondering about.
Are you talking about the 15-year anniversary art book? But
I'm guessing it must be the Dark Horse book. Is that what you're referring to,
yeah, that
Fiona?
is the Dark Horse book. I thought that was available to everyone.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure it is.
I didn't know there was two versions, but apparently there are two versions of the book. So
I did not know that either. I know that I've got a really nice version that is available to everyone. It's a very large format book. It's celebrating 15 years of Ratchet and Clank, and it has I think pretty much all the artwork from a lot of the previous games, or some of the best concept work. And that was kind of weird because I think we announced it sometime. It would come out like last year or early February. It didn't come out until just recently, until like a couple months ago. So that's
right.
Yeah, that should be available to everyone,
Right.
unless something's changed.
Okay, well, Fiona, if you can explain to us what that separate book might be, then we can respond to that. Dragbunda says, I saw some of your artwork in the Kickstarter page. It looked very well done. I'm guessing that's talking to me. As far as I know, you don't have a Kickstarter up, Brian, right?
I do not have a Kickstarter.
Okay, well then
Maybe I should.
then I'll claim it so I can feel good about myself. Thank you for that compliment. I appreciate it.
That is some really good artwork. I was really impressed.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. All those years at Insomniac helped me practice on that, which is something I want to talk about in just a little bit. Remind me about just the balance between drawing and working in 3D, because I think that would be something interesting. And from your illustration background, that would be a lot of fun to get thoughts on.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, Fiona says, now that I think about it, this is a question you'll answer immediately, no doubt. Now that I think about it, will there be another Ratchet and Clank game in the future?
I get that question a lot, and all I can say is, Ratchet and Clank's very close to our hearts at Insomniac. Certainly, I can't talk about any potential future games because that would, that's just not cool. And we tend to like to keep secrets. So that's about all I can say.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. As I often say with these wonderful things called non-disclosure agreements, but you can't say anything legally. But then also you don't want to harm the ability of the teams team to make surprises for everybody. I mean, that's part of the fun, is getting to have a carefully designed future window for companies to be able to reveal their projects and things like that. And so, it's trust me, I have so many games that I'm a huge fan of. I'm very excited to see what studios do in the future, including Insomniac. And it's so
Yeah.
neat to be on this side and get to see all the amazing games you've brought out just over the past 5 years. Because I haven't been part of the process. The last title I worked on was actually Slow Down Bull with Lisa Brown. That
Oh, that's right.
the smaller title. And so, getting to see things like Edge of Nowhere become a reality, that just came out of the blue for me. I had no idea you were working on that, so that's really neat. So yeah, unfortunately, can't share details about future
Yeah,
projects.
it's funny. We're in a different industry. If we're in the movie industry, like you can look on a IMDb page and see that, Mission Impossible 9 will be coming out in 2025. Like sometimes they announce things just way in advance.
Mhm.
Variety or the Hollywood Reporter will just make these big announcements, and for whatever reason, they can still hype the movie and it doesn't like kill anything. But in the games business, we are pretty tight-lipped. We don't reveal things until we pretty much have something to show.
Yes, that makes sense. Dragmonda says, "Hopefully, I'll get this Spider-Man game someday." Yes, and you won't be disappointed. That's for sure. Yeah, if you're a Spider-Man fan or just a fan of good game design, I think that as the reception of that game seems to prove, it's quite an experience.
Oh yeah, it's a great game. I mean, I guess I'm biased, but I was really impressed at how it all came together. And I think with every game we develop, every some of our highlights at our studio, there's lots of ups and downs as you go through the process of developing a game, and there's always a point where you're just not sure if it's going to be a big success or not. And you're so close to it, you can't get that perspective. And there is just a lot of it's really a tough hill to climb to make these games. It's not easy at all, and you're working with a very large team of people, and so yeah, at any moment someone could get sick or something could go wrong. You could miss a milestone, things could get cut, and it's not easy. So yeah, it's really nice to see it go out to the world and get such a positive reception. And what's most wonderful is we included this photo mode, which I didn't realize how big of a hit it was going to be. But there's just photos splashed everywhere of Spider-Man taking selfies of him all over New York in different suits, and that is really fun to see.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I have seen a lot of those photos, and I'm surprised at how, like, I kept thinking, oh, this is somebody is taking a screenshot and doing some post production on it, and then I realized, oh no, it's actually from the game. That's pretty
Yeah.
amazing.
Yep.
hmm
Absolutely.
Fiona says there was another cover according to Insomniac Games Instagram. I think maybe it's a variant cover. So that's probably the same book, but with a different cover. Is my guess. So
Okay.
yeah, yeah, or
Yeah.
maybe it was a production photo as well, and it might have evolved since then too. It might be the case that there's only one cover. So who
Yeah,
knows?
I don't know. It's been it's really tough over all these years. I mean, it's been well over 15 years now. Ratchet and Clank, probably, I guess it was 17 since we started developing the first game,
Whew,
and it's all kind of a blur to some degree. There may have been a book that came out like 10 years ago that I'm just blanking on.
17 years. Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like that. So we have Will Overton. Now, Will Overton is a Rare artist. And I'm not sure if he's still with Rare or not, but he says Ratchet and Clank. We all looked at that at Rare and thought, why didn't we make this?
That is so funny. Well, Rare inspired us because that was wait that they did Conker's Bad Fur Day, right?
Oh yeah,
Yeah, yeah, of course. I don't know why I was thinking. So that inspired Ratchet and Clank, and of course Banjo and Kazooie.
right.
That inspired us as well. Those were two of the games we were looking at, and very closely. And yeah, that and like Fifth Elements, Star Wars, of course, were all big influences.
That's so neat. It's so neat to have somebody from Rare here and having Brian on the other end.
Yeah,
That's really
that's
neat.
fantastic.
That's very cool. Yeah. So yeah, Fiona says when she can find the link, I'll send it to you and Brian on Twitter. Yes, please do. I'm curious about this. Um, so yes. So I am curious if we can talk a little bit about some of those things that I had mentioned about kind of bringing the illustration experience into game direction and how that sort of evolved over time and how being an artist informs your storytelling concepts and how that turns into design sensibilities. Maybe I know that's a very general question, but maybe you can turn something interesting out of that.
Yeah, I have kind of a funny story to tell, and I don't mean to like really push my book here, but it's in my book.
Oh,
Is
don't worry, I'll push it if you don't.
There you go. Yeah, but essentially, this was probably in late '90s. I was talking to a project manager who's like also the lead programmer on a very small game called Running Wild for the PlayStation 1. And it was like a racing game with these animal characters. And we're trying to figure out how these characters would look. And we went back and forth for, I don't know, maybe like 2 hours, like arguing for some reason. Because I was saying, well, they should be more cartoony, more stylized, more fun, more mascot-like, which that was the term we used for Crash Bandicoot and Spyro and characters of that nature. That they were mascots, and then he wanted to do something more athletic, more muscular, more serious looking. And we just went back and forth for a long time. And then finally, the concept artist who had overheard us arguing just did a really quick sketch, posted it on the wall, and at the exact same time, I'm not making this up, we said, see, that's exactly what I was talking about. And so he and I were kind of imagining the same thing, but we were trying to use words to describe what we were thinking, and we were just using different words than each other. And so what that made me realize was just, the power of images and illustration is so important. And I started just thinking how and throughout my work, I would always try to incorporate some form of a drawing to explain what I was thinking, a diagram or a sketch, because it's so easy to get lost in the words. So that was so throughout working on the Ratchet and Clank games, I would design a lot of enemies. I would design locations, but I was designing them in terms of the 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 stats and their behaviors. I was looking at like, okay, this enemy strafes back and forth, he hides behind cover, he kind of pokes his head up and shoots or whatever it might be. And then I would also think, well, I need to sometimes just add like a little bit of a drawing to help give people an idea of what I'm thinking. And even though the artists had free reign to kind of do whatever they wanted, they would oftentimes look at that and I could see influences of what I drew incorporated in their drawing. And it was just a way of like getting people to all get on the same page a little bit earlier by including these illustrations that I would do. And I would keep them kind of crude. I wouldn't try to be like a concept artist where I was trying to like, draw what they would draw. I would typically use like Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator, and I would just do like this crude little fun, simple sketch. I'd try to have it look, well done. It wouldn't be like just, a shaky stick figure or anything like that. But it was still enough that the artist could add their own personality and interpretation onto it in a big way. And this was more of just kind of a fun, simple idea.
Right, and that seems to kind of spring out. Well, I guess branch out in having effects in other departments as well. Where you have uh, it really is interesting how many different ways there are to interpret what somebody's saying. It's a very subjective thing, and so somebody can take it just as you just explained, which that's hilarious, by the way. That somebody can say something and be talking on completely different ends of the spectrum, thinking the same thing, but at the same time, somebody could also be saying the same words and walk away with it with a completely different impression. And so having that sort of artistic representation of it, I think, can be extremely useful. That goes a little bit to what my job at the studio was in a way. Is I like to think of my job, and this is probably a really boring explanation of what it was, but I was in a way sort of a link between design and design and story, specifically with animation. Whereas part of my job was to balance with design needs and think about, I mean, hilarious simple examples where we might have something in a cinematic, we'd be very happy with what we did, and then there'd suddenly be a wall in the middle of a shot that
Right.
the environment team might have added to make a modification to a level, and that might have happened because somebody in design requested, that, oh, this room has to be a little bit smaller, and so now we would have to go into the cinematics and kind of grab everything and move it over a little bit and kind of reframe things. So much of the process really is modification and editing, due to some degree, and no matter how good of a job you do at this, some degree of miscommunication where or evolution that's occurring at the same time in parallel manner. Where you have like, well, design is doing their job and we're doing our job in cinematics, and it's impossible to stay on top of everything that could possibly happen. So much.
Definitely.
I don't even know what percentage of development that sort of type of kind of reevaluation work takes up, but I remember it being quite a lot, and I think we did very well by comparison.
Yeah, I think everyone has this ideal pipeline or structure in mind of how a team should work. It's like they think of it almost like developing a house where, first the designers come in and lay the foundation, and then the story people come in and create the scenes on top of it, and then we just add the bells and whistles and we're done. And that's just not the case. There's oftentimes, we'll try out a design, we'll think it's good, we'll have people play it, they don't like it, there's something that needs to change, and at that point we're going over our schedule, or we're past the deadline, but we want to make it great. But then that has this ripple effect with other departments and other creatives who are trying to work within the same space. And so we're oftentimes working on top of each other and we're not always in sync, even though as much as we try to communicate to each other, it's just bound to happen. There's always something that will go wrong. So there's surprises, things are unexpected. And, we try to pad our schedule here and there, or make room for iteration. But in the end, it's a very organic and creative process. And I think that's part of what makes it so special, kind of that feeling of adventure and not knowing what's around the next corner and what problem we have to tackle.
Yeah, that's both in the games and in game development. That feeling of adventure, you never know
Definitely.
what's going to happen. So that's
Yeah.
but that's part of that's kind of the fun of it, isn't it? And you have to have a really good team dynamic to be able to allow that to occur. Maybe the strength of the team depends on your ability to respond to these unexpected changes, and it's funny because I often sometimes younger folks who are getting into the industry will ask questions about, what are some challenges that you'll face within the industry. And usually when you're a student, or when you're sort of thinking on your own before you're part of a team, you think about the challenges that only you have to face, right? And
Right.
oh, I can, maybe if I'm an animator, I'll make great animation, and I just have to get myself to the point where I can do good enough work that it looks like what I see in games, or it's better, and then I'm ready to jump into a studio job. But what you might not be expecting are how many incredible hurdles you'll jump through while you're in the studio, because while you're trying to do that singular great thing that you're an expert in, some there are going to be all these surprises along the way. There'll be a change of deadline. There'll be suddenly you'll have an extra thing to do. You'll have limitations you didn't realize that you had. That's the biggest thing. Where
Yeah.
particularly in games, I mean, it's a little different than it used to be, of course, right? In terms of limitations, but with today's power, but you still have limitations, because as there's more power, there's more ambition. People want to do crazier things. You want a bigger amount of information on the screen at one time. There's it's always a balancing act, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. I think yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Where you're at a school and you're working maybe with a smaller group of people when you're in college, and then you get into the industry, and things just get magnified, 100 times. Instead of a four-person small team, maybe if that's something that you're working on a project at school, you're working with maybe 300 people, and the stakes are much higher. It's not just about a grade, it's about, millions of dollars and keeping the company afloat. And so you definitely will run into a lot of complexities. You run into politics, you run into just this kind of chain of decision making and hierarchies. And, it's still exciting. I mean, I think as someone new to a game development, if you just focus on your craft and you do a great job, you'll typically be rewarded and recognized, and you kind of will get your footing over time in terms of, who do you talk to, how do decisions get made, um, and what's the rules of the land, lay of the land, in terms of how do you work within this environment.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's definitely, I think, a shock to some people first entering the industry, but it's also pretty amazing to be working on with a crew of very talented people and working on like big IPs like Spider-Man. You know, I'm sure that's been a dream come true for many people at the studio. I mean, as a kid, I used to dress up as Spider-Man, so you know, those are really fun things that you're doing that make it all worth the headaches of working within a very large, you know, company.
Right, right. All right. So if I can just kind of get more into the sort of the personal side of being Brian throughout these days, you know, I'm curious about more about kind of like the types of projects you like, the things that, for example, like what do you have a favorite game? You know, and let's just make it easy and say it can't be one you worked on, just so that we can open up the doorway to just about anything like stuff that you love, movies you like, because I'm curious about some of the influences for yourself.
Sure. Oh, that's a great question. Well, you know, I guess in terms of games, you know, I like some of the more indie, smaller style games. So I certainly liked games like Oxenfree or Firewatch, which I guess are more of these introspective and thoughtful games that are kind of done on a smaller budget. So, you know, that's certainly something that even, you know, I'll talk a little bit about games I worked on. Some of the more rewarding games I've worked on certainly have been the smaller ones where the stakes haven't been as high, you know. And so I do love the creative process. And, you know, the funny thing about me is I don't typically play a ton of games. I play most of my games at the end of the year during Christmas break, and I kind of just binge on a bunch. But then for the rest of the year, I don't really play games so much because I love creating stuff, and I typically like to program like small little games in my spare time. So, or I like to just, I don't know, mess around. I make Halloween costumes, and I don't know, I just do all sorts of like fun little projects that I enjoy working on. So, you know, that's, I guess, you know, I don't know. I'm trying to think of some of the influences I've had. You know, like I basically love mysteries. I'm a big Agatha Christie fan, so I've read like Agatha Christie books. There's, you know, whodunit murders. I think that there's like the game designer part of me that likes these little puzzles to try to solve. So there's that. Uh, Boy, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
and what? Go ahead.
I'm just saying there's like a wide range of stuff that I guess I'm kind of into. So it's hard to pick any one thing and say this is what I'm all about, you know?
No, that's interesting. I didn't know you were into mysteries and that sort of thing too. That's intriguing. You know, with speaking of the Halloween costumes, by the way, I just have to let people know when Brian says he makes Halloween costumes, he doesn't. It's not what you think. It's over the top, insane, awesome costumes. And I have to say that my favorite one by far was the shrunken head
Oh, right,
costume. So
right,
Brian
right.
figured out how to make his head look like it was tiny, basically
Yes.
by by using a glass enclosure that had some sort of light distortion, right? That kind of made your head look tiny. It was like a almost like you had like an aquarium around your head, and
Yeah, yeah. I know. It's like there's basically in the back of a car like this one, you can put a large Fresnel lens on the back that shrinks everything down. So it's like a plastic lens that's very large. It makes everything kind of smaller. And then usually people put it in RVs so they can get a little bit of, they can see behind them easier. And,
Mhm.
you know, where they have a car with like a lot of blind spots, it's helpful for that. So I just took these, I put them around my head completely. And that was, that's what shrunk my head down. I put it like in this bamboo cage. I pretended that I went to Papua New Guinea as a explorer from the 30s, and somehow got my head shrunken, but I was still alive. And I think, you know, Beetlejuice, the end of that movie, there's a character with a very small head. That was a big influence as well. But yeah, when I had it lit up, it looked like my head was half the size, and it worked pretty well.
It was
My
amazing.
perspective was kind of crazy. Yeah, I felt like I was 1,000 feet tall, and the whole world was like fisheye lens, and it was kind of messed up,
Well,
but
it's
I still
especially funny
managed.
too because Brian and I are very different heights, so that made it all the funnier because Brian is quite tall and I am quite short, and so the juxtaposition of that just made it even funnier. So it
Right.
was so
Good
kudos.
point. Yeah, I was the size of the Empire State Building, and you were just a guy looking up. That's how it kind of looked to me. It was just
So it pushed it even further.
right there. You go. Yeah. Right.
That's fantastic. This is game design, folks. This is the
Exactly.
fun. This is the day-to-day fun that you get to have. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I do want to mention that I have a lot of interests and do a lot of different things. I feel like it's all always benefited me in terms of design and creative direction. I think that you can't just learn everything from playing games or watching movies. You need to try to live a full life and pursue different interests because it can inspire you in many different ways.
No, that makes good sense. Yeah. How can you pull reference if you don't have reference?
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's
absolutely.
sort of I talked about this a little bit over the past couple of weeks. I can't remember if it was during a live stream or not, but I was talking about sort of the copy of a copy effect, where if your influences are all somebody else's creation, you that there's a degree of fall off whenever somebody creates something that is based on a real life reference, right? That okay, there's the reference, and then there's their own artistic interpretation. So there's a degree of separation between the real world and what that is. So if that is actually your reference for that real world event, there are some things missing from that, including your own ability to think creatively about that real world reference. So I agree with Brian in that sense that it can be great to take influence from other influenced creations for different reasons, but it's great if you can have that. You almost get sort of a magnified amount of inspiration from real life experiences that you don't get from just saying, "Well, I love this game, and so I want to make a game like that game." And you can kind of avoid that copy of a copy effect.
Absolutely. I was just trying to think of a good example, and one idea was back in the year 2000. I used to go to these there's like these desert dance parties. This is back in my wild days when I was in my 20s. But essentially, you'd get this was before they posted anything on the internet. You just get this piece of paper, and it was almost like a treasure map. And it would say, "Drive on this road 100 miles, make a left on this dirt road, drive for another 2 miles, and then at this like wonky looking tree, make a right or something." And so you do all this, and you eventually come over this hill, and you'd see all these tents, and there'd be a DJ with speakers out in the middle of the desert, and they would just be playing music all night long. And I'd hang out with my friends, and we would like the sun would come up, and we'd all be dancing. This kind of silly stuff that I guess us Californians do, and and it was a lot of fun. It was a blast. And around
That's
that
amazing.
time, we were trying to come up with weapons for Ratchet and Clank, and I was thinking like, what if there was like a dance ball, like a ball you could throw, a disco ball you could throw out in the air, and everyone would just start dancing, like at these desert parties was what I was thinking. And at the time we were like, there's no way we can create all those animations for this early game, and I don't know if we have the memory for it. There's a lot of reasons we couldn't do it, so we didn't do it. But then when we were working on Tools of Destruction, they were like, hey, what about that dance ball idea? Let's do that. And that became the Groovatron, which is probably one of the more popular weapons. So, those are the kind of things where it kind of that all sort of influences you in your perspective in terms of the decisions you make and how it adds life to a game.
So getting to hear from Brian with all this, I'm sure is awesome for people who are curious about game development. But this is mostly incredible for me because I'm getting to learn all of the history of the stuff that I did not know before. I had no idea that the Groovatron had that antithesis. What is it, Genesis? Yeah,
Right.
that's amazing. That's fantastic. Yes, absolutely. Now, we're being visited by Juan Carlos. Remember Juan Carlos, Brian, who's an animator on
Oh
Ratchet and Clank,
yeah, I
amongst
remember
other
him.
games. And so
Yeah.
Juan Carlos says, "Hi,
Hey,
Brian. Hi,
hey
Dave.
Juan, how's it going?
Yeah, you guys look good." He says he misspelled Brian, but he said unless you like that misspelling, he meant the
Well, I
correct
can't
spelling.
see anything right now because I'm on my phone, but that's fine.
Yeah.
No worries.
Well,
It happens all the time. Usually I get
yes.
brain.
That's right. Now, yeah, and yes, we've had the chance to work with a lot of different great people over the years. I have no idea how the team has evolved since I've been there, but I understand there are quite a lot of new people. So that's got to be interesting.
Yeah, I have to admit, I don't know everybody's name at the company. I think we're at 350 people.
Whoa!
I used
Wow!
I used to try to learn everybody's name, and there's so many new people. Well, I don't know if we're at 350 now, but we have it kind of goes up and down depending on the situations. But
Right.
yeah, we're close to like 300. And
That's
for a while
amazing.
there, we operated for about like 150 people for the longest time. But when we started developing Spider-Man, the team definitely grew.
Hmm.
And everyone there, that I meet and encounters, really awesome. I think we've done a really good job of bringing in some really great people. But yeah, it's changed quite a bit. I mean, it's still the same in terms of I think the culture and the spirit, but we're dealing with bigger games now like Spider-Man, and we're certainly working with Marvel, and working with Sony. We've worked with them forever. So I'd say a lot of things have stayed the same, but definitely the size and scope has changed.
All right, now here's a careful question. So I it's a dangerous question. So, but I feel I just have to ask is how do you what are some projects that you would love to create one day? And I obviously it's you have to tiptoe around anything that you are working on, but maybe just something that's like a dream project down the line, something that you would love to work on. Don't feel that you have to spoil anything, but maybe if there's anything that would just be like the ideal Brian project, something that you could do. I have a feeling I know what that might be, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. Certainly I've always wanted to make a graphic novel. That's something that
Oh,
as
good.
a
I'll sign you up. We're working together on the next one.
all right, sounds good. That's something that I really it was a rewarding experience working on the book. Graphic novel for me is something that I love to illustrate. I love storytelling. I love framing shots and working as a almost like a film director, making a little movie. And it's very can be very personal, and you have like full control. And so that's something that I've always dreamed of doing. It just takes a tremendous amount of time. So I'm certainly developing some ideas right now that if I have any spare time outside of game development, which is really hard to find, I can kind of plug away, or at least sketch out a story that, maybe one day when I'm got a long beard and I'm retired from game development, I can sit down and
Well, the,
create a
the
graphic novel.
beard's a little longer than I remember, so you're on your way.
All right, yeah, there's definitely some gray in it. So,
Oh,
um,
I've got that. That's no big deal.
yeah, yeah. So that's something I think a lot about. And then I've also thought about interactive graphic novels. If there
Mm,
was something there in terms of making simple decisions and having decision trees, or having some form of agency where you're trying to solve a mystery. And that's something that's always appealed to me, is like kind of taking the experience of like reading a good whodunit, but letting the player kind of try to help solve some of these puzzles, like the smaller puzzles within the bigger puzzle. Because a lot of times in reading a mystery, there's all these clues, and you kind of leave it up to the reader to remember all the various clues and try to kind of make all these connect the dots. And
hmm.
that's part of how a mystery works, is sometimes you kind of lose your way, and some people are maybe trying to guess the whole time, where others just kind of give up at a certain point. They're like, I don't know, it could be any one of these three characters, could be the murderer. And so if you can have a way where players can interact and solve and make steps towards getting closer to a conclusion and help them guide them, then there could still be an element of mystery on who is the murderer, but they might have a really good guess.
I see.
And then at
Now,
that point, there's that feeling of like, oh, I got it right.
now with that, when you say interactive graphic novel, are you thinking something that would have like an interactive component tie-in, like using a separate device, for example, like if you had like an app on the phone that kind of worked with a graphic novel, or do you mean that the graphic novel itself you would experience like on an iPad and it would have all those interactive components within it?
Well, that's a great question, and that's something definitely that I've thought about. Is I love books, and there's something really nice about holding a book in your hand.
Hmm.
I guess I'm kind of old fashioned like that.
I'm right there with you.
So yeah, so there is an element of, you could potentially um, have it all be like riddles or things that with answers, I guess, that you could give people, where they could feel like they're reading through a part of it, and you ask a question, and then you give them the pieces to try to figure it out. And that's definitely cheaper than the technology side of things. But then I also like the idea of making something more like a game, a video game, and having some level of interaction where you're putting puzzles together, and you're getting feedback based on the decisions you're making
Mm-hmm.
to help
Yep.
kind of guide you to figure out some of the answers or solve some of the questions.
Maybe something that works in tandem. A physical book with an interactive component separately. It could be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely like lots of cool things with AR too, which is kind of fun,
Yeah.
where you can
Yeah.
hold your phone over a book and things come to life inside the book, and I'm sure there's something there.
Yeah, that's something I've looked into a little bit over the past few years. Nothing that I can explain right now, but there have been some thoughts about that. So yeah, we'll see what the future brings. That's neat. That's very cool. And I know that as just through my experience of working with you, that you have a strong passion for storytelling, and I think that's one of the reasons that I kind of let off talking about the balance between story and gameplay, and how you're able to bring that sort of narrative into the experience and the challenge. Because while I can't talk too much about the specifics of our development process, there were times when I would try and do some experimenting with how to do things like pre-visualization in interactive formats and things like that for storytelling. And that was a really big challenge, because how do you get the player to look where you want them to look, and what happens if the player runs off in the totally wrong direction? Are they How does that affect the pacing of the story you're trying to tell? Because pacing for me is such a huge element, right? Where you have uh, I want there to be a certain progression. In a movie, you can do this. You can say, look, here's the beats, and we need to make sure that the player gets this experience at this time, or the viewer rather. With a game, you either have to force it or you have to allow it to happen naturally and encourage. And that's a really tough balance.
Yeah, a lot of times in games you're almost developing like a theme park. That's what oftentimes we compared it to, like looking at how Disneyland's designed, and that feeling of both the sense of openness and agency and exploration, but yet you're drawn to these, like in Disney, they used to call them weenies. I think Walt Disney would compare it to like leading a dog with a hot dog or a weenie dog. And those are the things you're always thinking about, is how do you attract people, but yet they feel like they're always in control, and they have these moments of discovery, but you're in a subtle way kind of guiding it. Uh, and then you can have these more focused moments. And that's something, just throughout Ratchet and Clank, I've always thought about the pacing. You're thinking about the challenges that you're throwing at players and what you're presenting them with, and the density of combat or traversal actions that need to occur. And then you're also thinking about the story that you're telling, those down moments that would occur where you'd give people a little bit of a break, that ebb and flow, I guess, essentially, of a level. And then when you have opportunities to offer up a little bit of story, maybe a character, voiceover over a radio or something comes in after just a very intense battle sequence. So you're always thinking about that ebb and flow and how to tell a story within all of the interactivity that a player has.
Right. Okay. And so I have to ask, what is your favorite game you've worked on?
Great question. That's a really good question. I guess I have a number of favorites. So I have my favorite games that I'm most proud of, and then there's but they weren't necessarily my favorite games to work on. So, A Crack in Time is up there in terms of one of the games I'm most proud of having ever created or worked on. But when I look back at that development experience, like I wouldn't want to repeat that. It was just a
That was
pretty
a tough one.
brutal time period.
That was tough.
Uh, And then in terms of games that I really loved working on, but and I thought they did well, but they're not necessarily my favorite. I certainly enjoyed Quest for Booty. That was a really fun experience working on a small pirate game. If you, you remember that.
Of course, yeah.
And and, um, and then Into the Nexus was another one that was a real blast to have worked on. But
Yeah.
that wasn't like the epic, a crack in time, type situation.
If I can just interrupt very, very quick on that Into the Nexus, it's funny because I actually feel the same way. I do think that a crack in time. The titles will always be funny to me.
Right.
That a crack in time was probably the game I'm most proud to have had a chance to work on because it really was a splendid result, I think. And but it was hard, and that was actually the second project I worked on full time. So we jumped, and I had started with Resistance 2, which was late in the cycle. So I had a really warped impression of what development was going to be like. With Crack in Time, there's so much that I got involved with from the beginning with that one. But Into the Nexus, actually, I think I had the most fun working on. And and not to get sappy, but honestly, one of the reasons was how hand in hand you and I got to work on that one, because we got to go to North Carolina for that development period, and it was only about a month and a half to 2 month period that we were there. That was a very surreal experience to me. That now that I think back on that, it's sort of like the existence was the studio. That maybe part of it was that I wasn't used to being in North Carolina, and we stayed in a hotel while we were there, and it had this.
Right.
It was surreal, but it was so much fun to work on, and that there was such an energy with the team at the time, and there was something so much fun about the way that game was being made. I can't quite figure out what it was, and for me that was also challenging because that was getting toward the end of my time at Insomniac,
Mm.
and so it was kind of like I had started with this bombastic, very expansive Ratchet title with Future 2, and ended with Nexus, which was a quieter game that where all the how to put it, it's like all the wheels were greased. It's like we know what a Ratchet game is supposed to be. We've done this before. Let's just make one that's a lot of fun. We got a little deeper with the storytelling in that one too, I think, even though it was a shorter experience. I think there was a bit more drama in the themes that we were working with, despite
Definitely.
and it dealt with themes that I think were really interesting, and it was just a ton of fun to work on, and I appreciate the chance that I had a chance to work on that.
Yeah, that was a real blast. I think that it was fun. It was fun going to North Carolina, definitely, and that reminded me of Insomniac when we were a smaller studio in the late '90s, where it was 40 people or so, and it was all in like one small, kind of a smaller space than certainly the Burbank studio now, which is like multiple wings and holds 250 or 300 people. Uh, yeah, and I guess it's kind of funny how when the technology has matured and you've worked with people, we'd worked on a Crack in Time, and then to be able to then take all of our uh, um, familiarity with how we work with one another and our experience and kind of take that to a smaller game where there isn't as much complexity, I guess, and I guess I don't know. The stakes aren't as high. The higher the budget, the higher the stakes. It seems the more pressure you get from many different sides.
Hmm.
So working on these small games is always a treat because you just feel like you can exercise your creative muscles and have fun and maybe experiment a little bit and not worry too much about um, if something goes wrong. It's like your failures are much smaller, I guess, in terms
Hmm.
of working on a smaller project. But you still want to make something great, but you can take those risks.
Right, right. Yeah, and sorry, I cut you off as you were continuing on past Nexus.
Oh yeah, no problem. So I mean, yeah, Into the Nexus, we definitely went a little bit darker, I guess, with those themes. You know, there's some deaths that happen, which is kind of something I think will surprise people. And we played around with that kind of horror theme, which was great. And I actually took some of that, some of what we learned, even though I guess in terms of horror it was more like Scooby Doo, but I took some of what we learned to Edge of Nowhere. And actually, I worked with the North Carolina team, the same team, on developing this virtual reality project. And that was really another highlight, I'd say, of my career developing that game, because I was definitely outside of my comfort zone, having developed all these Ratchet and Clanks, and to focus on this darker H.P. Lovecraft period piece adventure set in like the 1930s out in Antarctica. It was really fun, and that was, we definitely tried out some new storytelling techniques in terms of how we work within VR. So yeah, I think it's kind of funny when there's that there's a thrill of working on a very large game that has lots of exposure, like Spider-Man. Developing that, I was actually the director of experience on that, so my focus was on running a lot of user tests and getting feedback from the team, and then providing that. And I would oftentimes add some creative feedback as well. And so that was kind of a different. I was out in more of the periphery. I wasn't like, in the center where like I had been on previous games. And so there's a thrill of working on something like that in a much bigger environment with a lot more directors and a larger team, and then seeing the response it gets. And that's exciting. But then there's at the same time the thrill of working on something smaller that you feel like you have more ownership over, and you have more of a voice, and you're not, and the process is smoother. And so I think it's always tough to kind of pick between those two, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's tricky. Yeah, right. It's a balance, and of course, you don't control what it's going to be with each project, which is also part of the thrill. You don't necessarily know 100% what the studio is going to move on to next, and you have to find a way to make every project a passionate creation. And sometimes that's definitely going to be easier than others when you're in a professional environment. But one of the things that I think is most rewarding is, just personally, is when you can find a way to make a project. This sounds how to put it. You find a way to make a project something that you can really infuse your own creative passions into. And even though you might never have expected, like, oh, when I was in college, I think, oh, I don't think I'll ever. I don't know that I'll ever have a chance to work on a game that's called like a crack in time.
No.
But it's like,
Right.
but then it's like you realize, oh, the game that's called the crack in time is so much like the games that you loved as a kid. And how neat is it to get to work with them, and how cool is it to get to work with this team. So that's really very rewarding for me. So it was a lot of fun to be able to take part in those
Absolutely.
projects. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, there is this kind of nice back and forth where sometimes you're always honing your craft no matter what you're doing. You should always try to do the best job you can, because every experience you're just learning from. And sometimes, I've worked on projects maybe that I haven't been as proud of, or I didn't feel like they were as successful as I would have liked for them to have been. But I look back and there's always something to glean from it, and something that's helped me as a director or a designer or a creative,
Hmm.
and that's something to never lose sight of. And really, you're typically always working with some very talented people. It's the fun. Just, sometimes I have to remind myself I work in video games for a living. How awesome is that?
Hmm.
And even though there's a lot of the same stresses that come with any job, we're ultimately, entertaining people, and that's a kind of a dream come true. And I don't know. It's just that's something that I have to keep thinking about, and it's a pretty awesome situation. And it's really refreshing. Like just the other day, I got a letter from a fan who I had written to 10 years ago, or they wrote to me, and I sent her, like, I think a Captain Cork T-shirt and something else, and she wrote back to me and just said how much of that had a big impact, and she wants to work in video games and would love to work at Insomniac. So that's rewarding in and of itself,
That's
to be able
fantastic.
to have that effect on people's lives.
Yep, agree. That's amazing. And yeah, as I think back on now 5 years away from the last time I was at Insomniac, it's always bittersweet when you leave a company in the pursuit of something else, for obvious reasons. But if I were to break down the percentage of what I loved about being at Insomniac, it was getting to work with the team. It's an overwhelmingly high percentage of it was, probably as much as 85% of just as you think back on the joy of getting to work, it is the process. It's getting to be part of a creative team and getting to work with that much talent in one space is a rare treat, a rare opportunity, so that I'm extremely thankful for as well.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, it's definitely not easy. I mean, it can be a very brutal process. I think,
Yeah.
I think that people have this rose tinted glasses when they think about developing games that were just like 20 people who are just laughing and playing games and writing code and
Yeah, for 1 hour on Friday, that's
that's
what.
pretty much it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's there's some real stresses that happen with it, so it's definitely a balance.
Right, and the stakes just seem to rise all the time as the industry grows, and you get to work on titles like Spider-Man. Yeah, as you say, that's pressure I don't remember having at the studio to quite that degree.
Yeah, and a lot of people stay in the industry. I think the average is like 6 years that most people stay in the industry, because they either move on just because well, it's a very volatile industry. There's oftentimes studios will open up and they'll be around for 5 years and they'll close. People, teams get laid off. There's just a lot of, Insomniac's one of those rare places. I've been there for 19 years now, and it's definitely kind of this island in this ocean of the stormy ocean. It's I guess an island of calm is what I meant to say in a stormy area.
Yeah, that was a fortunate thing with Insomniac for me. I didn't have that sense of perspective on how rare it is that people can stay at one place for as long as that and kind of make it work. And I think that's part of the reason that Insomniac is able to produce such high quality games. Is that you've been able to people feel a sense of stability and comfort in the studio that they don't typically get in other studios. And having left the studio, I can see that in relative terms with other studios that are constantly, worried about what next year is going to bring. It really is. It's almost how to put it. It's a I don't want to say it's very fortunate that I had a chance to begin with that experience, but also something that ill prepared me for the rest of the industry because it's just not like that in general. So that's one of the great things about Insomniac.
Right. But you've gone on to work on these awesome books and illustrated books, graphic novels. Like, how's that been going for you? How's ukulele been going?
Well, it's good, and the thing about it is it goes back to what you had said about why you might want to work on a graphic novel. Now, you and I have talked many times about storytelling, both professionally and just personally, and it's obviously a huge passion for both of us. And when I left Insomniac, I had left under the terms that I had this nagging project that just had to be made under you know and to any capacity, which included leaving a great job, moving across the country to an area where the cost of living was not so high, and cars don't
Mm-hmm.
get so hot,
Right.
and just kind of making a go at an industry that's was dropping its success rate. The books really weren't selling quite what they were doing, and so it's kind of a crazy move when you think about it, but the passion to create something, the desire to create something like that, just doesn't shut up. It just doesn't. And
Right.
I said this in another stream that in the last year, despite the period working on Into the Nexus, the last year at Insomniac, I felt it had begun to affect my job because I was so worried about like, oh, how's this book going to come out? And I kept thinking about, oh, it's 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock or whatever I'm going to go home and begin working on this book. It's like I kept thinking about it. I kept invading my day. And so there's a certain point in time when you just have to say, all right, I'm just going to go do it. So I went and did it. It took twice as long as I thought. It took 2 years to finish that book. It's done and it's publishing next year. It's going to follow Yuka. And there's so much behind that as to why it's coming out afterward, despite being finished first, and it has an awful lot to do with harnessing an audience and trying to get more people on the work that I'm doing. There were some publishing offers for Dreamside, 2 years ago, but it wouldn't be the right deal. It wasn't the right time, and I felt that I had to just kind of bite the bullet one more time and work on something, one more project. Even though I was 2 years in and anxious to kind of get back to work in a studio environment or something at that point, because I had finished the project I wanted to finish. Well, the first book of it anyway. I think it was kind of it was a very surprising path. And now that I'm at the Kickstarter has reached its goal, so I'm very thankful for that and thankful for everyone's support. And it is setting up something wonderful, where the desire to work on Yuka comes from so many different places, not the least of which is what I mentioned about wanting to work on something that's an established brand, but it's also something that I'm extremely passionate about. The games that inspired Yuka were huge to my childhood, as Brian mentioned, Banjo-Kazooie and the like. And it's a pleasure to work with that team as well. It's a totally different team, very different dynamic. And I'm not really working with them so much as in support of them, with support of them. But when this project is done, I think it's going to springboard into doing more projects. I'm calling it the Game Legends series, where I'm reaching out to studios and trying to do some of these great adaptation projects, because I think there's a huge gap when it comes to comic adaptations. I just don't think there are a lot of great ones. I don't think the ones I don't think there are nearly enough for the games industry, which is so jam packed with awesome games. It's bizarre to me that there's not been too much branching into really high quality graphic novels that take the same passion of the game development and move it into the book. And Yuka is going to be 2.5 years. That's a full game development right there, making this book. And as you said, a very complicated. Yeah, it's a huge project. It actually took me longer than the Dreamside book did, which I didn't expect. And it taught me an awful lot about finding that passion in another universe. When I'm, once I had kind of gotten the Dreamside book one out, I could be like, okay, now I can turn that passion on, that experience now onto something else. So anyway, that's how it's been. I mean, and we'll see what the future brings. I expect, once Yuka's out, we'll hopefully find more great relationships with studios. I'm excited about some of the ones I've talked to already, that are excited about possibly doing a book next. And maybe, knowing what your passion is, maybe we'll end up collaborating one day on one of these. That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, you never know. I'm curious, like, what is your day like in terms of developing a graphic novel? Like, I've heard some people will illustrate it, they'll sometimes it's by the seat of your pants in terms of writing it. You write maybe a page each day, and you don't quite know where the story's going, but you kind of have a gut. Or do you outline it in advance, or write the whole thing down in advance? And
right.
Then,
well, okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I have more questions.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I think very old school in terms of how I develop. What it sounds like you're referring to is more the webcomic style, and that has more to do with the needs of a webcomic, where you can do with a webcomic really two overarching ways. You either plan a whole bunch of comics in advance, you have an overarching story, and you know what the story needs, and then you do it on a day-to-day basis. But that's always going to involve a lot of evolution as you progress, and that is cool for some projects, but not cool for others, because I really like to have, at least the stories that I'm telling right now, I like to have a very cohesive vision. I actually start at the end. I want to know what I'm saying with the story, regardless of how funny it is, or dramatic it is, or whatever it is. The ending comes first, because that's what gives me the value. That's what tells me what the point of the story is. Like, I have to know where it's going. I can't just have fun making it. Once that's down, so the story actually comes first for me. And Yuka was written relatively quickly, because I think I had a very good idea of what I wanted the story to be, and something that would take the dynamic of a buddy duo, which of course I have tons of experience with Ratchet on that. Between
Right.
Ratchet and Clank, you have Ratchet and Clank. You had Yuka and Laylee. You have Banjo and Kazooie, and so I'd always thought a lot introspectively about the relationship between the buddy characters and how to take that game dynamic where one has abilities the other does not have, and play in on that a little bit. Make one the protagonist that has to rely on the abilities of the other, and if what happens if you separate them. And of course, we experimented with that a little bit, right? With Crack in Time, where you get to play as Clank separately
Right.
and Ratchet separately, and even in Banjo-Kazooie, there were times it wasn't a very story centric concept, but where you can separate Banjo and Kazooie. And I remember the powerful limitations that you experience. I thought that's a great story dynamic, is because it also plays into a strong theme of trusting in the experience and knowledge of others. And so I thought, well, the player is a hero. The player goes in and tries and saves the day with this hero character. But what happens when you encounter a situation where your abilities are essentially useless in a world? And that's kind of that's what I think makes the story interesting. It's in a secret tome world. It's just a play on Yuka. You enter into these fantasy worlds through magical book tomes. And this is like a secret sixth tome, so it's like it continues from the game. But
Oh, wow.
if you remember Donkey Kong Country, remember the Donkey Kong Country games?
Oh, yeah.
Well, remember how you would unlock a secret world if you had mastered the game, and then you'd think, "Oh, this is going to be a lot of fun." You get in the secret world, and it's as hard as nails.
Right.
Because and what they would typically do is they would twist around your. This goes back to game design. They twist around your experience as a player, and say, "Okay, normally." You have all these great abilities, but now we're going to surprise you with how those abilities are turned on you. If in the game you can hover, for example, say you can jump and hover, in the secret world, that might be a hindrance, because you might have a lot of really, really short little jumps you have to do. And if you're hovering, it's kind of hard to navigate. So I played on that game design concept for Yuka in the story, where Yuka really just gets his butt kicked big time in this book, because his abilities do not work well. It's more about flight. A lot of flight is needed, and so he has to rely on Laylee and on other characters to be able to reach the end. But he starts the journey thinking, I have to do this because I'm the hero. I have to do it alone. I've got to save the day, And so that's the narrative arc, essentially, is Yuka learning that he, in the process of trying to protect everybody, he's actually not able to do it. So you write a story like that, and then the rest of it is so much. There's so much that's just procedural. You just take it day by day, and you say, all right, this is the page need. This is, as I'm working on the page, I'm evolving it. I lack vision. I really am not a very good visionary, so I have a lot of trouble seeing the page before I'm working on it. So
Oh,
I have to
wow.
kind of feel through the dark a little bit. I just start laying it out, and then I'll see what has to change. And that's why having the ending, the anchor, is so important, because it's the only way I can remember what I'm trying to say with this page. Okay, I know that it has to convey this, and it's not yet, so I know what I have to change. So sorry, that's a long-winded answer to your first question there.
No, that's great. I mean, I think you're right about the whole ending in terms of really with any good story, you're almost asking a question at the beginning. You have like that inciting incident, and you kind of launch into Act Two once the hero crosses a threshold, goes into that adventure, and that at that beginning, it's like the hero is typically faced with this problem, and as a creator, you have to know what the answer is. How does this all get resolved, and then what are the steps? What is the journey that they go through to get to that resolution? And I think we've all experienced bad stories where you feel like the author doesn't know where this is going, and you have no
Yeah.
sense of where it's going, and it's an uneasy feeling. It's not a feeling of like, oh, it's a mystery and it's there's something under the surface that I have a sense of, and I have a feeling that I'm in good hands with this creator. you know so we've had those bad story experiences, and I think the good ones, that there's a logic, there's a reasoning behind everything, and maybe there's still you're not sure, you're hopefully going to be surprised by the ending, but there's this guiding force throughout, and it sounds like that's
Yeah.
something you definitely have as you're working on this.
That's a challenge with it, right? Where you know what you want to say. Ideally, you know what you want to say with a story. I don't know. It's fun to work on something that's a mystery, and artists I think are really good at asking questions. We're
Mm-hmm.
really, really good at coming up with the mysteries. Like, wouldn't this be intriguing if you had a story with this a guy's alone on the street at night and he sees this figure going off into the distance, and he follows him and it leads to some underground thing. You just come up with these sort of progression of mysteries, but you have to know what's the ultimate ending. Is actually, it'll be much easier if you begin with that. It's just as long, but I guess the challenge then is to make sure it's not too procedural, and you can make sure that there is mystery and fun and surprises, as you say. So yeah.
There was that quote: "Surprise yourself and surprise the reader. Surprise the author, surprise the reader."
Mm-hmm.
And we always have to, in the end, surprise ourselves as we're developing a story or a book. I feel like whenever I'd have like a eureka moment while working on the Ratchet and Clank games, and just come up with something that I got excited about, I would oftentimes feel like I would see that in the reviews later, where it's like, oh, this is a really fun idea, or they really surprised us with this, and it's like, oh, at the time I felt surprised. And I think if you feel like you're just kind of going by the numbers and you're writing a story and like, okay, I got to plug this and I got to plug that in, and it is too procedural, you run the risk of boring your audience.
Yeah.
And I think like a lot of times in a good story, about halfway through, something big changes, like everything flips. In Star Wars, I guess, to use that example, the Death Star tractor beam just ends up sucking them into it. They weren't heading to the Death Star. They were heading to Alderaan or whatever planet got blown up or something.
Right.
And so that's usually, I find, when you're developing a story, that big twist, you're about halfway through a story, you start to get bored with your own story. So it's good for the author to change things up and get yourself excited.
That
and
makes
you'll do
a
the
lot of
same
sense.
thing for the reader.
Yeah, and a lot of those things can be minor, as I'm finding, that so at least seemingly minor, but they become some of the most memorable aspects of it. There have been plenty of times where when I was working on Yuka, I would come up with something at spur of the moment when I'm working on a page. As I say, I kind of lack vision, right? So it's hard to see the completed thing. But one of the benefits of that is that when you're feeling in the dark, you just sort of get those sparks where you say, oh, wouldn't it be funny if, or wouldn't it be neat if you did this? And you think, well, I can't do that because it's getting too off track and I'm worried how that will derail the story. I think as long as you can be careful about integrating it, sometimes those sparks and surprises, if you just kind of let them happen, really, actually, not only can they be the big memorable moments, kind of as you say, that other people will pick up on, but they actually end up assisting the story in the end. I have plenty of examples like that with Yuka. I'm trying to think of some without spoiling the story, but I had like is a simple example with, I don't think this is spoiling much, but there's and it's so goofy. I have there's like a sort of a boss battle in the book, right? It's sort of a play into the concept of a boss battle in the game. It's not obviously not actually a boss battle because you don't play the book,
right?
But it plays on that idea, and there's a method of instigating that boss battle that was a simple story thought I had. How does the boss battle begin? How do Yuka and Laylee enrage this monster? That it begins a fight with them. And I came up with something that made sense at the time. It took me a little bit of figuring out, but at the beginning of the story, there's sort of a foreshadowing of that particular thing that they do. And it came from a simple spark of, oh, wouldn't this be hilarious if, if Laylee does this one thing in this one scene, it will be just funny at the moment, but then also later on, you see her kind of, it's actually Yuka who does the same thing later on after chastising her earlier for the same thing.
Oh, nice.
And you have this ironic thing, but because Yuka is the one that screws it up, when the time comes, that now amplified the story theme, because Yuka, being the hero, he's trying to do the right thing. And at the beginning, he chastises Laylee in essence for doing this thing, but then he is the reason that later on by doing the very same thing in the world, and this becomes now a significant story beat. So just kind of letting these things happen, as long as you remain focused on that main central theme that I call it the premise, or the reference the moral premise, which is kind of another a whole nother thing. I want to get the creator of the moral premise on one of these one day to talk about that.
Oh,
But
right.
just where you have something where you have sort of a virtue vice dynamic, and you know, you just be aware of that so that when these sparks come up, you know how to naturally integrate them into the experience.
Absolutely. And I think you talking about that experience where you might chastise somebody and then make the very same mistake yourself and do the exact same thing, and then what do you do at that point? And that's something that we can all relate to. It's a very relatable moment. And I think with a lot of good stories and games, we're learning about life essentially. When you read a book like that, or you watch a movie where a situation like that occurs, we're always wondering, like, well, how's this person going to handle this? And if I'm ever in that situation again, because I've been in that situation before, how might I handle this? So, I feel like as creators, we have this opportunity to show people solving these, weird social interactions that happen. How do you do right by, others? How do you kind of resolve these issues? How do you be humble and admit that you're infallible, and you've you make mistakes, and or you're not infallible. I think I used that word wrong, but anyway, how do you essentially uh, solve some of these problems? And with a game, we're sometimes there's oftentimes simulations that we enjoy, and we're doing things I think on a more primal level with a game, whereas we're defeating things or destroying things, but we're kind of managing things too. We typically have like an arsenal that we're managing between weapons, like on a Ratchet and Clank game. And so I think there's always something that people feel like they're drawing from on some deep level that will help them in another aspect of their life.
Yeah, yeah, that's got to be a real challenge with games because I just think about it with the book, and it's like, okay, I can just make it. The book is simple. It's linear. I mean, it's hard to do, but it's linear. You know what it's going to be. Like if I work this theme in here, it's down on paper, it's done. But I often reference one of my favorite examples of what you just described is the Silent Hill series, which is obviously a horror themed game
All
series.
right.
But the second game I talk about, have been talking about since I played it back in 2004, still in awe of what they accomplished with that. Because what they're able to do is take a traditional narrative concepts like we're talking about, where you have these sort of central themes, and integrate that not only into the design of the game, but encouraging, if not outright forcing the player to live out those themes through their decisions. And that's amazing. So I'm in awe of designers' ability to integrate that sort of narrative work in a way that makes the player make the decision. Because if you can read it and say, "Oh, I can relate to that," that's incredible. That's great. But if you can realize that you made a decision as a player that demonstrates the vice side of that theme, of that premise, then that's mind blowing for the player. And because now they've really made it theirs. They said, "Oh yeah, I guess that's really a powerful theme because I've done the same thing." I just remember Silent Hill 2 doing that incredibly well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I'm
yeah.
not as familiar with that game, and it's certainly been a question that's come up in terms of how do you make decisions that may affect the narrative or affect the other characters in the world. And of course, the Telltale games kind of delved into that pretty deeply. But it's still, I think, a challenge that no one's really fully um, conquered in any kind of way. It's like it's very rare that a game kind of goes into that level of interactive storytelling, and presents these moral dilemmas, and then also somehow sorry about that. This is just like there's a helicopter flying overhead, and
No,
there's
no, you can't really hear it.
oh, you can't. Oh, good. Yeah, I thought I was gonna come to a quiet park where we could have a little conversation, and it's like all chaos has erupted around me.
That's part of the fun of the stream.
It is. I know. I guess so. Yeah. Um, so yeah, I mean that's something that's an interesting challenge, I guess, for designers and developers. How do you take this interactive medium into a space where we're somehow making more higher level informed decisions about what affects the world and the characters, and not so much about the strategies in defeating characters or becoming richer through progression systems, through wealth accumulation.
Yeah, and just to kind of cap off on that thought a little bit, that was part of my motivation for doing the Game Legends series concept, right? Is I came from, a game studio where we had that sort of battle between storytelling and interactivity, right? Where you have to think about that. But I thought a totally other facet, and maybe this is just getting kind of old school, is that you have a game that's about gameplay, whether it's a narrative-based gameplay or a different style, maybe a more arcade style, more action style. But the point is gameplay ultimately, whereas a book is all about narrative, and obviously there's no gameplay in a book. So it's an interesting juxtaposition to have a book that ties in with a game where there's a relationship. It's not like a merchandising thing. There's a relationship between the developer of the game and the creator of the book to do what each medium allows you to do the strongest. So with a book, I can tell a story that I can't really tell in the game, or I prefer not to, because the game benefits from allowing more interactivity. And so that was part of the motivation behind this, is to think about things that you can do in Ukulele the game. And so I just to elaborate a little bit, when I got started with it, I started thinking about projects to adapt before I kind of settled on Ukulele, before I developed that relationship, was to try and decide what projects would be ideal to do. And I thought, well, the most sensible thing to do would be to work with companies that have very story-centric games, where there's a lot of work that goes into the story. And I thought, well, that's more ideal. Like, I wouldn't want to work with, say, an arcade shooter game, right, that would have not much opportunity. But what I began to realize is we were both developing the same thing, where the game studio is trying to do narrative-centric and the book is trying to do narrative-centric. And they're just kind of, we're butting heads, right? Trying to do the same thing. I thought, actually, the perfect type of game to adapt is one that does not have a profound story-centric concept, because now you can add that with the book and the two will sit hand in hand perfectly. And you get something from one that you don't get from the other. And that's, I think, what made the Ukulele project actually perfect, is that when people were talking to me, they said, I can't believe you're adapting Ukulele, because it's not like, there's no story in the game. And I said, that's the point.
Right. Well, yeah, that's the great thing, is that you're taking a medium that does really well at telling stories, and then they're embracing the interactivity of video games for that medium. And yeah, the two do go hand in hand with one another. And I think we underestimate the amount of excitement and interest that people have in a particular game that they really enjoy, and they want other ways to absorb or get into that content. And so offering a book that complements it kind of scratches that itch. And Ukulele has like this very rich looking world with these very wonderful characters, and so I'm sure many people want to know more about who they are and the challenges that they might face and decisions they would make in terms of more of a story level.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I should correct myself. It does have a story in the game, of course. It's just that it's not it's not story centric. We'll put it that way.
Right.
So yeah, and the same thing can go for all different types of games. And so yeah, who knows? Fiona does say that hoping for a new Ratchet and Clank comic book someday. So I'll keep bugging Insomniac to let me work on Ratchet.
That's right.
Clank. Now that might be fun to do together. See, we're back working on Ratchet and Clank.
And there you go. Right. That could work out very well. Maybe
I think so.
We contact TJ Fixman again.
Yes, of course.
Who wrote the comic books and the games.
Right. That's
Many
right.
of the games.
Yeah, everyone that I worked on, TJ was involved with. So that was neat. So so I'll tell you what, we're actually, believe it or not, we are coming up to 2 hours.
Oh my goodness! Wow,
chat.
That just flew by.
Yeah, it did. I could talk to you forever. I mean, we have so much experience working together, but we also, I think, have such a similar concepts of ideas that we'd like to make. Just kind of story centric things that involve new concepts and ideas. So we could go on forever and ever. But I do want to make sure that people know where they can find your book. Now, I'm going to post the link in the description for Brian's book, Directing Video Games 101. Is that is the title, right? That you like, as I know it there's a
A
subtitle.
lot of people call it that because the cover looks like it's Directing Video Games 101. I kind of like that, but it's really Directing Video Games 101 Tips for Creative Leaders.
Right, right.
And but you can go to directingvideogames.com, or you can just search on Amazon for Directing Video Games,
Yeah,
and
and
it'll
I'll
pop
put
up.
that link in as well so that you
Yeah.
can find this book. I do highly recommend it, and it has delightful illustrations in it as well. You can see that Brian has taken his game design sensibilities and put it into a book, which I think is really cool. So reading the book is on. It has that ease of usability, ease of access, so to speak. So yeah,
Yeah, there's 101 colored illustrations. So it's, I really tried to make it easy to digest, especially for people who might be working in games and have very busy lives. So it should be, it's easy to read. And yeah, if you, and of course, at the very, there's an Easter egg located in somewhere. So once you find that, feel free to email me.
what? I didn't know
But
that.
yeah, yeah.
Well, now
So
I gotta look. Yeah, and Fiona says she already has a copy of the book, so there you go.
oh, awesome. Well,
So
thank you,
I'll
Fiona. That's great.
So for maximum humor, I will assume that you just bought it and got it so fast that and read through it in the time that
Right.
that the stream has occurred. So yes, but thank you, Fiona. And yeah, so Brian, is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we call it quits?
No, I just want to say that, it's a pleasure, always a pleasure chatting with you, Dave. And of course, it was a pleasure working with you. And I'm really excited for your book. I'm really happy that it surpassed the Kickstarter mark. So I definitely look forward to reading it. And we'll have to chat again because I just want to know your whole journey in creating that book so that when I am old and grizzled with my long white beard and I start working on my graphic novel, you can give me some tips. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
for sure. Yeah, and likewise, it was obviously it was an immense pleasure getting to work with you at Insomniac, and it's been great for us to kind of loosely stay in touch over the years. We could always it'd be great to chat more in the future, as you say, and it'd be great to do more of these live streams. I mean, I'm trying to be more active with these now. Just now that I can actually talk about what I'm working on is great. The project's been under wraps for so long. It would be really nice to have you back on, and we can kind of talk in generalities about the various musings of development and ideas that we have to work on for the future. So I really hope we can get a chance to talk again.
Absolutely, we will. Let's plan on it.
All right, for sure. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. This has been great, and as always, you'll be able to find this video on my channel. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button, all that usual stuff that people say you're supposed to do. And yeah, look for the links to Brian's book as well as a link to the Kickstarter for Ukulele and the Cracklestone in the description of the video. So thank you so much for coming. Brian, thanks a lot for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That was awesome.
Okay. All right. We'll see you everybody next time.